Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, joining us is author of more than 17 books read by millions of people in 29 languages around the world. He teaches worldwide, speaking to men and women from all walks of life, including leaders in the fields of health, psychology, education, business, politics, sports, entertainment. Let's just pretty much say anything any human being ever does, he's talked to them and probably trained them. He's certainly the pioneer in the human potential movement. He is also the author of the best-selling classic Way of the Peaceful Warrior, which was adopted into a film starring Nick Nolte. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dan Millman. His newest book is The Four Purposes of Life. We'll discover how we can find meaning and direction in a changing world. Dan, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Well, good to be here with you, Daniel. I'm definitely beyond 50, so...
Well, one thing we certainly do by the time we're at midlife is we certainly tend to really examine or analyze our lives if we feel that we're at this point where I thought I'd be a lot further along or something about life would be a lot different, don't we?
Yes, or someone once said if I had known I was going to live this long, I would have taken better care of myself.
Isn't that the truth? Now, let's talk about the four purposes of life. It's interesting when you see a lot of books out there, especially when it comes to human potential, that there is a list. There's always 7 secrets or 12 steps, this, that, or the other, but these are 4 pretty well-known paths, if you will, or purposes of life, isn't it?
Well, the first one certainly is learning life's lessons, but there's much more to that well-known idea than meets the eye. We can get into that. But and of course, finding your career and calling would be the second purpose in the book, which most of us think of when we think of what is my purpose, what am I here to do? It involves often career or calling. But the other two, purpose number 3 and 4 in the book, are less known or appreciated, I think. So hopefully we'll have time to get into that too.
Now, why don't we go ahead and get started, keeping it simple for our listeners out there about what the 4 purposes are.
Why, sure. Let me provide a context first. When I was writing the book, a friend of mine said, "Well, I know the purpose of life, Dan. I don't need to read your book." He said, "The purpose is learning to love. Whatever the question, love is the answer." Hey, that sounded good to me. I couldn't argue with that. And another friend said, "No, the purpose for humanity is awakening, is enlightenment." Well, that sounded good as well. And many people come up with different ideas for what our ultimate cosmic purpose is here on Earth. And yet, if we just as we divide the days of the year into 4 primary seasons, and we divide the points on a compass into 4 directions, by looking at our lives through the 4 purposes that I present here, it brings an overall sense of structure, organization, understanding. It sheds some light on our paths, which can feel pretty chaotic when we look around. Once in a while, we pull our heads out of the sand and go, well, what's going on here? Yeah, I go to work every day, or I go to school, but what is it all for? Occasionally, we come to that place. And so this is designed kind of to help us keep our head in the clouds but our feet on the ground and connect our daily lives to a larger sense of meaning and help us to live it in a more aware manner. That's why I actually wrote the book. And it could have been the 3 purposes or 2 or 1, but it just came out these 4. They seemed like the most central things we're actually doing here in everyday life.
Now, it's pretty important that we learn life lessons, and that's what you first talk about in your book, is that there are 12 of those. And sometimes, as I was reading those, you think to yourself, okay, I think I'm starting to get it now, but why does it seem like it takes all of us so long before we go, oh, now I understand?
Well, the first section on learning life's lessons is based on a supposition that the earth is a kind of school for souls and that daily life is our classroom. Whether or not one believes that the earth functions as a school for souls, we do notice that lessons tend to repeat themselves until we learn them. In our relationships, in business, in finance, and if we don't learn easy lessons, they tend to get more dramatic. Someone once said, first life throws a ping pong ball, and Later on, maybe a bowling ball. So it's wise to learn the lessons earlier. And in fact, it's more radical than just saying, yes, we learn from our life experience. We all know that. What I'm really suggesting is that no one needs to read my book or any of my books or attend any seminars by me or anyone else in order to continue to evolve and grow as a human being. Daily life is guaranteed to teach us everything we need to learn in order to evolve. Now, someone might ask, well, Dan, why do you write books then? Why do you teach seminars? Because I found that good reminders, good perspectives and principles can help people to learn more from daily life, can learn the lessons easier, a little less pain, a little more grace. So that's why I write books and teach. But it's all about what we're here learning in everyday life. And as you pointed out, Daniel, as it happens, there are 12 courses in which we are all enrolled. They're not optional courses. And in order to graduate or really to mature as human beings, we're all enrolled in these courses, and I do list them or give a summary so people can, well, let me put it this way. Let me interrupt myself and say, I've had this recurring dream, and I wouldn't even share it because we all have dreams, but I believe you and many of your listeners have had the same dream or one very much like it. It goes very simple, like this. I have an important exam, maybe in college, maybe in high school, but it's a final exam. I wake up, I'm about to leave, and I realize, oh no, I forgot to go to the classes. I forgot that I'd signed up for the course, and yet I've got to take this final exam. Now, after talking with many audiences, I'm really suggesting that a good portion of your audience has had that dream, whether or not they remember it, because the irony is that is our human condition. Every day we get tests of one kind or another, but we don't know what courses we signed up for. So that's why in the first purpose, in that section, I at least summarize what these 12 courses that comprise daily life, what they are about. And for example, the first course is discovering our worth. And that's not, and I define it as different from self-esteem. Self-esteem is feeling good about ourselves, feeling confident. But our worth answers a deeper question, really in the subconscious. It's how good of a person am I? How do I view myself? And therefore, how much of life's blessings and opportunities do I deserve? Because not everybody feels the same way about that. And in fact, it's the source of self-sabotage, how we get in our own way sometimes. That's why it's the first of these 12 courses we're all enrolled in, to recognize our innate worth as human beings and to treat ourselves as we might, with a compassion, we might treat someone else. And then it goes into reclaiming our will. It goes into energizing our body. These are foundation elements. And then there are the 9 other courses in the School of Life to give a perspective so we really understand what daily life is about, not just going to work or school and going through the motions.
Now, I liked one of the 12 life's lessons, which was exploring the mind. And as I was reading that, I started reflecting back when I first had that discovery many years ago of, what you think you tend to act on depending on how heavy the emotional charge is. So, for instance, when I put this in perspective for the listeners, for those who are working that 9-to-5 Monday through Friday job, they're trying to pay their bills. They're looking forward to Friday and Saturday and Sunday because it's finally going to be that weekend away from something that they're getting to a point they dread. There's the Monday morning blues, so you go in with a pretty bad attitude usually. Most people, they say, have heart attacks on Monday mornings just before work. And you think to yourself, the perspective of what someone's thinking is as Monday comes around. And this is something for our listeners out there. Then you have that emotional charge, and the more charge you give it, the more you dread, depending on what your thinking is about that. And as I became aware of this particular neurobiology going on, if you will, I started realizing, wait a minute, I can start kind of really controlling this once I become aware of what my thinking is. And slowly but surely through habit, it began to liberate me away from that, and I realized at each and every moment I have a heck of a lot more control about what I do and how I am in that moment than I ever thought I had before. It was very liberating.
I agree completely. Liberation is the right word. And taming or exploring the mind is one of those 12 areas. It's one area isn't more important than the other except for a given individual at a given time, because these things pop up like whack-a-mole. You've seen that game. One thing pops up, then another. But in terms of dealing with the mind, Mark Twain once said, "I've had many troubles in my life, most of which never happened." Because most of the troubles we have are either about the past or the future. You were talking about someone's thinking about going to work. That's the future. So part of that exploring the mind, that term mindfulness has become very popular, but it's really about just paying attention to what's in the present moment without judgments and seeing what's going on in the mind. So people who do mindfulness meditation just sit quietly, watch those thoughts and emotions arise and pass like the weather, and they get some distance, or as you say, liberation from those thoughts. So they become, rather than commanders, they become just tendencies or whispers, and we get some distance. We start to see the nature of mind. It's why Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosopher, said, as soon as you have a thought, laugh at it. Because we begin to see that thoughts don't actually have a reality. There's nothing wrong with thoughts. We can have all kinds of thoughts, positive, negative. We can use our mind to think about things we want to. Sometimes other thoughts pop in uninvited. But as we get distance from those, by understanding how the mind works, we begin to focus more on, yes, that's fine. I'm feeling this. I'm thinking this. Good information, but what do I need to do right now? And we begin to center our lives more about constructive action, because the better we function in life, the more we get done that we need to do, the more likely we are to feel fulfilled and satisfied in our life. So dealing with the mind is one of those 12 areas for sure.
And I think it's also important, too, as I was describing, that once you can get liberated from that, where you can lift that veil, because usually a thought, again, if it has that emotional charge, throws a veil over you on a situation where you see it other than as it actually is. And I really appreciate the quote that you had from Mark Twain, because it reminded me of one that I had heard probably about 2 months ago that I had known for many years, but when I heard it, I was like, I get it now. And back in, I think it was the 80s, I started studying Eastern philosophy, things like Zen and Buddhism and so forth. And one of them was, of course, the popular book Sun Tzu and the Art of War. So this particular quote that I heard, I think it was on a television show I was watching, and it was, Sun Tzu says that you will fight many battles in your lifetime, most of which there is no imminent danger. And when I heard that, I was like, that's exactly right. Most of the battles we fight in our lives really won't cause us any danger, because the battles are within ourselves. It was to know your enemy is to know yourself. And it just blew me away that I got it.
Yes, that's great. It's funny, Ramakrishna once said that if you try to open a walnut when the shell is green, it's almost impossible. But if you wait until it's ripe, it will open with just a tap. And in a sense, daily life, back to that first purpose, daily life is our ripening process. So eventually, we hear something as you did, and we're ready for it, and bang, we get it. It penetrates us. And in the same way, as Sun Tzu said, in my first book, Way of the Peaceful Warrior, and in the movie based on the book, Socrates, I actually got this line into the film, or the trailer anyway. He says, I call myself a warrior, a peaceful warrior, because the most important battles we fight are on the inside. And many people can appreciate that. If we are able to overcome self-doubt, overcome insecurity, overcome fear, and these are all internal things, then our external life flows much easier. And it doesn't mean we never feel self-doubt again. It doesn't mean we never feel fear. Of course we're going to feel these things. But it's how we respond to them. Customato, speaking of quotations, the boxing coach once said, heroes and cowards face exactly the same fear. They feel the same fear. They just respond differently. So it comes back to our response to things. What will I do now is a key question of life, rather than how can I change my feelings and thoughts to live a better life? Because that's a very popular idea. It seems easier somehow than changing our actions. But the horse I'm betting on is action over time. That's what's going to make a difference in our life.
That's very true. Now, there's why the self-help industry has, maybe a 6% success rate. Because of exactly what we're talking about here. You have those habits, those thoughts, so forth, and like you said, the big catchword of the day is mindfulness now. All of a sudden they've grabbed this ancient word, so to speak, and it's this new thing that we just found deep in a cave somewhere, but the fact is it's always been there. But what's funny about that is that, as you're talking about, is that I think one of the neatest things I heard, I was flipping around through television one night, and here I was in the stream of religious channels, and there was this one doctor that was on there talking, and I really got engaged in what he was talking about. And he was talking about disappointment. And he says, disappointment is inevitable. It's just going to happen to you. But he says, discouragement is a choice. And I thought, how wise that truly is. Imagine how many times we get disappointed and we think it should have been, or how come the good things happen to that guy. We get caught up in our discouragement, and it just causes us an inertia where we don't take that action as you're talking about. And life is exactly about that. It's taking those steps. You're going to get disappointed. What are you going to do about it at that point? What are you going to do after that? What are you going to do after that? And you're moving forward in the moment. And again, it gets back and it becomes very liberating, and you start making different choices than you would before.
Well, I definitely resonate with that. In fact, there's probably a lot of truth to the saying that no one fails. They just at some point quit trying. And that's what you were saying, that this discouragement can be, I'm done, I've been defeated. But we're only defeated when we say we are. Shoma Morita, a Japanese psychiatrist, had a wonderful saying. He said, when running up a hill, it's okay to give up as many times as you want, as long as your feet keep moving.
Now, why is it difficult sometimes, because you talk about this in the second purpose in the book of the Four Purposes of Life, that we have trouble differentiating between a career and a calling? I know there's an area of discouraging because you think of your calling because you hear, follow your bliss and the money will follow you, or something like that, People get out there and they attempt this and they go, well, how come I'm broke and this and that and the other? But then again, here's one of those that I remember. There's a particular story of someone that I know who started a business, decided to get involved with having, I think it was a food cart, and they were fairly successful in the restaurant as an employee. So they start this business and were scratching their head and thinking, how come a year later this hasn't completely replaced their income? And that's what's interesting about people who think they want to become, they're self-employed, is there's this thinking that when you start a business, all of a sudden all this money is going to be made. And believe me, you start a business and there's a lot of hands that come knocking at the door. But that's one of those situations where they start becoming discouraged because they can't really count on themselves. But I say everyone should go into business for at least 3 years, period. Because believe me, a lot of life lessons of those 12 that we've been talking about are going to pop up. And that's the greatest learning curve you could have in anything, I think.
Yes, that brings us back. That kind of ties together the first purpose, learning life's lessons, and the second, finding our career and calling. I talk about the idea of voluntary adversity in the first section. Where,
I like that. Voluntary adversity.
Absolutely. We actually intuitively look for that, because if I ask people sometimes, how many of you have done a sport or a fitness activity, and many hands go up, and I say that's voluntary adversity. Life is tougher when you take that on. Life is easier when you don't do a sport, when you don't learn a musical instrument. But we do those things. We take on that adversity, that challenge, voluntarily, because we intuit that it develops us. We become different people going through that process. Same with getting married, maintaining an intimate relationship. People laugh when I call it voluntary adversity, but my wife and I have been married 40 years. We're best friends, but still, it is not always easy. Same with raising children. And the next example I give is business. As you said, Daniel, going into business is a form of voluntary adversity, and it's a form of spiritual weight training, you could say. You know, you don't lift any weights, you don't get stronger. So this develops a different kind of person as we take on these challenges.
Because I remember one night my wife and I were out at a fundraising benefit, which was a big Monopoly competition, which was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And this was right around the first year we started our business, about a dozen years ago. And what was interesting about that night was what I came away with it. There were a lot of real estate developers and entrepreneurs and this, that, and the other. And here we're mixing and talking with them. What a better place to meet people who are business-minded, if you will, than in a Monopoly competition. After all, if you know the rules, you're just as good as anybody else is, right? Just the luck of the roll. But what I took away from that night was these people aren't any smarter than I am. And what was astounding is how years later when that new Steve Jobs movie came up, and I happened to catch the quote before the movie came out, where Steve Jobs actually said, you'll discover that people are building things and creating these things, and that they're no smarter than you are. And he says, that'll just liberate you forever. And I was like, I know exactly what he's talking about. But until you can get in there and learn these lessons and cultivate these things and experience the experiences you have, those aha moments won't happen as much, and that's why it's so important to take action, as you mentioned earlier in the program.
Yes. Well, in terms of career and calling, since you asked about that, the second purpose in the book, the reason it's important to understand the difference is just as you said. We're told, do what you love and the money will follow. And sometimes the money doesn't follow. Often it doesn't. Because what those advisors are talking about is following our heart, following our calling. Our calling, by definition, is something we just love doing. We don't always know why. It could be a hobby, a sport, playing a musical instrument, a craft, or it could be a calling like in the military or the clergy. But whatever it is, it calls to us. It may or may not ever involve making money. If we get good at it, if we're one of those rare people who get so good at it, they find an opportunity and it becomes a career, that's terrific. But a calling is primarily not about money. Whereas in a career, even if we like it, it has perks, we like the people we work with, we find it meaningful. Still, if we weren't making any money doing it, we'd have to find something else, because it's a fundamental human need to become independent, to support ourselves and our family. Even those who are independently wealthy may find something to do because it gives them a sense of connecting with people. So it's important to understand the difference between career and calling, because it helps starving young artists who would benefit by getting a day job to support doing what they love, so they could stabilize their life, move out of their parents' basement, and live a full life rather than just starving while they practice the guitar 16 hours a day, which may or may not lead somewhere. Whereas many people on the other side of the coin reject anything to spend their time on that doesn't make money, because they're so focused on career that they may have abandoned a calling or a hobby, something that brought them fulfillment and some joy. So it's important to understand the two. Sometimes they combine into one. My career and calling have merged. But that doesn't mean it's any better. It's fine to have a career, then a calling. We don't have to love our career. If we find it suitable, if it somehow matches our talents, values, and interests, then we found an appropriate career for us, but we don't have to love it every day. I don't think anybody really does, unless it happens to be their calling. Someone once asked me, Daniel, how do you know if your career is also your calling? That's an easy one. If you won the lottery, would you keep doing it at least part-time? If you would, it's a calling. If you wouldn't, it's a job.
And here's also another way to look at it, because my partner and I, we were just talking about this yesterday, that idea of talent. And there's a tremendous amount of myth, I think, around what talent is. You know, there you are, you're on the Little League team. Billy's the one with the talent on this team, and the other 12 guys are just kind of here to support him. And so that would make the rest of the team kind of think, we've fallen short somehow in the, call it the uterine lottery, if you will. I wasn't given the talent Billy was here. And so we had talked about this, and I said, to me, what I think talent truly is somebody has a passion for something that's above anyone else who has passion doesn't have passion for the same thing. So let's go ahead, since I quoted Steve Jobs. He was one who had a passion for aesthetics, especially when it came to the world of computers, and that's why Apple was known to be to the level that it was. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't a lot of tech people out there, computer geeks, if you will, that didn't have the same passion, but they weren't probably driven like he was day to day to day. Another example is Larry Bird, NBA legend, the kind of guy that showed up to practice early and left late because he had a passion for the game. That's the talent of the game. And I think that if people understood that talent isn't some mystical thing that's sprinkled on a few, but that it's in all of us, and discover that talent really is a passion for a thing, to the point, as you just said, if you won the lottery, that would you still do what you're doing? There's your talent right there. What are your thoughts on a thought like that?
Well, I'm really aligned with what you've said, because for 30 years I've been talking about talent. Clearly, I was a world champion gymnast on the trampoline and a national champion and so on in some various gymnastics events. And then I went on to coach at Stanford University. I coached the top U.S. Olympian, and the team, after 3.5 years, was one of the top 3 teams in the U.S. So I really considered this question of talent. And it seemed to me, from my own experience and observations, that talent was about 20% innate or inborn. Certain body types lent themselves to certain sports and had some advantages over other people with different body types. But it seemed to me that talent could be 80% developed. And I said, well, if that's true, if talent can be developed, what qualities do we need to develop in order to become more talented at athletics, for example? Because it's very visible. And it seemed to me that there were 4 words that start with the word S, or the letter S. Strength. Obviously, if you're stronger, you learn faster and easier. See, I define talent in the sports realm as the ability to learn faster and easier and rise to higher levels. That seems like a pretty fair operational definition. It's true in playing a musical instrument, for example, too. So muscular control is the first. The second would be suppleness or flexibility. Most people would nod and go, yeah, that makes sense. The third is stamina, ability to continue over time and persist. Like Thomas Edison, we've all heard the stories about him in persisting. And the fourth is sensitivity, qualities like coordination, rhythm, timing, balance, reflex speed. So I actually trained the gymnasts, not just in the skills of gymnastics, but building their foundation of talent. And that's how we got the results we did in 3.5 years, and what rose to the heights, because they became more talented. So to me, I agree, it's not some mystical thing. Many of us, when we try something new, we conclude much too quickly, oh, I lack talent, because we start comparing ourselves to other people. But we may not lack talent at all. We may just lack experience, because it takes time to nourish whatever talents we have, whether it's in business, communication, sports, any field. It takes time to nourish that talent and to figure out what qualities you can develop to build that foundation to help us to go faster, easier, and rise to higher levels. So that's my mini talk on talent. I think we're probably pretty much aligned in that area.
Yeah, I was also thinking of, just yesterday as we were talking about that, it came up where I said to myself, yeah, I always kind of wanted to be somebody who can cartoon a little bit. Well, no, you don't, because you would have picked up a notepad years ago and started doing it like you see these other guys on the bus or on the bench in the park, and that's what they do all day long. That's talent. Right. They're developing the fundamentals of something they love to do. And I wanted to bring that up because I just there's so much confusion about that, and that if people could have more clarity and realize, so if I just put myself in action, if I just pursue this and try to develop to the best I can be, that's all that really matters. In the end, you feel happy about it. And I think that's one of the underpinning things that your book talks so much about is it's getting out here and enjoying life and knowing that we do have those disappointments that will come along, but there's always that gift in there that's going to lead you where you need to be, so to speak. And although we've only covered 2 of the 4 life purposes, because I wanted people to actually pick up the book, take action, as we've been talking about, discover these things for themselves, is there a website, Dan, that people can find out more about your book and about your work?
Sure. My website is peacefulwarrior.com. And there's even a life purpose calculator which deals with that third purpose.
Which I was going to go into, but I thought I'd kind of save that for our listeners to be able to pick that up.
Sure. So, yeah, I appreciate that. PeacefulWarrior.com would be the place to go if anybody's curious about my work and the 4 purposes of life.
Very good. And I will say on behalf of you, for the listeners, the 4 purposes of life is one of those books you can sit down in a couple of hours at best and you're done. But it's the simplicity that becomes very complex as you apply it. And that's what makes it really fascinating, like that classic from Eugene Herrigel's Zen and the Art of Archery. Simplicity, yes, but profound. And I love that. And I want to thank you so much for being on the program and sharing that with our listeners today.
It's been a pleasure, Daniel.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in, discovering the 4 purposes of life. You can find out more by visiting us also at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. You can also follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio as well as Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.